I, Shaka Hislop, Honorary President of Show Recently Red Card, with our latest and probably last edition of a 25 for 25 podcast in 2021. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by three sitting MPs. We've got Caroline Nokes, MP for Romsey and Southampton North, Conservative; Chi Onwurah, MP for Newcastle upon Tyne, Central, Labour; and we've also got Chris Stevens, MP for Glasgow South, who's been an MP since 2015.
This is 25 for 25, a Show Racism the Red Card podcast. Make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Morning, Shaka.
I'm going to just jump right into it. It's been a year or a couple of years that we've all had to take pause and reflect on so much that's been going on in our lives and around our lives. And in particular, a particular concern to Show Recently Red Card has been the murder of George Floyd, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. Can I ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Caroline, just to give us an example of an earlier encounter or experience that shaped your thinking around racism and your own political view on it?
So I think for me, one of the earliest experiences that really shocked me, so I'm very lucky, I represent Southampton, which is a multicultural city, really outward looking, has had masses of immigration over the last few hundred years. And I was talking to a guy during Black History Month, a guy called Lou, who runs it for the city. And he was talking to me about the racism he faces every single day in our city. And I must have had this sort of look of complete incredulity and disbelief on my face. I was like, what here in Southampton? And he literally said, yeah, Caroline, every day. And to me, that was my first wake-up call, that Black people in our city, a city that prides itself on having a really good multicultural community, having a great interfaith network, people were suffering racist abuse every single day on the streets of our city. And for me, that was a real, it was a real wake-up to me that we have to continue fighting against racism. We can't be complacent. We can't assume that the battle is over, because it's a long way from over.
Chi, I'm going to assume that is something that you can identify with so well, and on a personal level, given your own ethnicity and growing up in the Northeast.
Shaka, I can't remember a time when I didn't experience racist abuse. Actually, probably, I grew up in Newcastle, and racism at the schoolyard. One of the incidents I remember really well, we got our windows daubed with dog poo and go back home. But I remember particularly sort of the rise of the National Front in the 70s, and Margaret Thatcher's we are being swamped speech, because that made me really feel that there might be a sort of political movement which would take me away from my mother. My mother was white, and that was kind of if you like, I was always very political, and I also saw racism as being part of the fight for social justice, which the North has always been involved in women's rights, civil rights, trade union rights. But I felt that the need to make it have a political response as part of the fight for equalities, and that my ethnicity, which was just about who I was suddenly a political issue rather than just about who that I was me, Chi Onwurah. So I think one of the things I'm really sad about is that when I think about that 7-year-old kid, and now today there are children in Newcastle who are growing up experiencing racism, experiencing Islamophobia, experiencing those kinds of prejudices. One of the things I'm proud of, though, is that when I was a kid, I would not go near St. James's Park on a Saturday afternoon, because that is when the National Front would be out and they'd be calling me names, and they'd be saying, and they'd be in their literature, Now, I go to the match, and it's the program sellers and the food bank who are out there. So there's been a big change in that way.
Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Shaka. I mean, I think for me, what the George Floyd murder incident showed me is that the institutional barriers are still there. We have developed as a society. I mean, there are television programs which I watched when I was very young, which would not be allowed in television now because of its portrayal of individuals. But I think that it to me showed up the institutional barriers are still there, whether it's the police or other figures. And I think that it demonstrates that we have some way to go, whether that's the selection even of parliamentary candidates and councillors, or whether it's looking at boardroom changes in business and even in the public sector. You see very much that there's still a male, pale and stale a development there at the very top of a lot of companies, a lot of public sector organisations. So it demonstrates to me that we still have some way to travel to make sure that we eradicate racism in our society.
Sure, Racism the Red Card proudly boasts as being the largest anti-racism educational charity in the United Kingdom. What are your own positions around education in tackling racism, and what more can be done politically? What more can be done by your respective parties politically in growing education around anti-racism? Chi, I'm going to start with you this time.
Well, Shaka, I absolutely, and I know some of the work that Show Racism, the Red Card does, as well as other charities in schools, and talking and listening to children particularly. And I do think that's absolutely essential. And I do think there is more to be done, particularly around the teaching around racism, and also the recognition of the long-standing, some of the myths that people are subject to, the recognition of the long-standing contribution that Black people have played in this country. So we would like to, the Labour Party would like to see more recognition of teaching about Black history as part, which is British history. That's why we say in Black History Month, in the curriculum. There's also other things, because as Chris talked about, there was structural and institutional racism which needs to be addressed. And for example, a mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting, so that we recognize the impact that it has today in terms of people's pay. I also think there's a huge amount to be done with the online safety bill, which is coming through, which currently does not, for example, recognize the online abuse and how that cuts down people's ability to express themselves, regardless of their race. And I also think that in terms of recognizing the role that culturally, celebrating the contribution of Black people culturally and as well as in education, but we've got to do that for as young as possible.
Caroline, we at the organization have long called for a true teaching of our history, a history that reflects the good, the bad, and the ugly. But there has been real resistance to that. Why is that, and what more can be done to have a more accurate telling of our history, every aspect of our history?
So I think this is a really important point. And earlier this year, I did some work, because I'm chair of the Women and Equality Select Committee. My Select Committee did some work with the Petitions Committee, which had received over 100,000 signatures on petitions from young people, predominantly young people, calling for Black culture to be embedded in the curriculum. I can remember going into a secondary school in my constituency and saying to them there that I don't think Black History Month is enough. You can't condense it just down to history, and it can't just be a month. You have to make sure that you're teaching about the richness of our culture throughout the whole year and across every subject. And I think it's really, and I always say this, as a select committee chair, it's my job to hold ministers to account and to convince them to change their minds on issues. To date, I think I've made too little progress with the Department for Education. I think there's still resistance to changing the curriculum. You get a really, I always describe it as a hackneyed phrase of, oh, well, the freedoms are there for schools to teach what they want within the curriculum. They can choose to champion figures from ethnic minority cultures as well as white cultures. And I always use the example, and you'd expect this from me. My constituency is where Florence Nightingale, I would always describe her as the mother of nursing, lived and is buried. And so when we're talking about nursing and the history of the Victorians in this constituency, it's really easy. Let's go use Florence as your example. And the reality of that is that young people here miss out on the information, the teaching about figures like Mary Seacole, who've contributed so much to modern nursing. And I think it's absolutely incumbent upon the government, not individual schools to make the decision, but upon the government to say, you have to teach a curriculum that is broad enough, that explains to all of our young people, as you say, the good, the bad and the ugly in our history. And some of our history is real ugly. You take it back a few centuries and Chi and I would be burned at the stake for being witches, wouldn't we? There's some really nasty stuff. But we have to teach about that, and we have to teach about the slave trade and how our cultures have joined over the years, and the difficult relationships there've been, but also how far we've come. And I obviously absolutely acknowledge there's still a long way to go, but we've made progress. But we don't achieve anything by not including that in our teaching.
Chris, sitting here in the United States, critical race theory has become a catchphrase that's maligned, misrepresented. But ultimately, isn't that what we're asking for, to have our schools speak of race, how it's affected different aspects of our society, and why the resistance, not just here in the US, but at times I've sensed it in the UK, that there's been this effort to avoid the telling of some of those stories through slavery, through colonialization. Is this something that Scotland can set an example of?
Well, thanks, Shaka. I think that, firstly, I think language and education are vital in eradicating anti-racism. And having seen Show Racism Red Cards work in Glasgow South West, where two footballers are describing in quite simple terms what the difference is between an asylum seeker, a refugee, and an economic migrant, was an absolute thing of beauty. And I've actually said this in the House of Commons, that we should probably bring Show Racism the Red Card into the House of Commons and teach some politicians the difference between asylum seekers, refugees, and economic migrants, because I think that the word migrant is totally misused in political discourse. And I think that goes back to your key question. We need to acknowledge and understand the institutional inequalities that have went back decades. Caroline had mentioned the slave trade. It gives me no comfort. Glasgow was built in the slave trade. It was built on tobacco. The brutal reality, but you don't get taught that at school. I didn't get taught that at school. I was taught about Glasgow and the tobacco lords and how Glasgow was built as a city, but underneath that, it's quite clear that there was slavery going on. And I think that we do need to acknowledge that and tackle that. And I think that we need to share all of our history. Our history is not all positive. Some of our history we do need to examine and look at and make sure that these things never happen again, and making sure that the language we use to each other is such that people don't get offended, and that we don't use terms which people will find offensive.
I'd like to get to the political discourse in a moment, but you raised something there, Chris, and in your previous answer. 1 in 10 parliamentarians are of colour. Is Parliament a fair reflection of our society today?
No, I don't believe it is. And actually, unfortunately, the figures are worse than the Scottish Parliament, where it's 2. Now, to be fair, they are 2 high-level politicians. You've got Hamza Yusuf, who's in the Scottish Cabinet, as Cabinet Secretary for Health, and you've got Anis Sarwar, who is the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland. And we've only just started to see more MSPs elected at the last Scottish elections last year of colour coming through. I'm thinking of Colcab Stewart, who was elected in the Glasgow Kelvin. We need to do more. And indeed, the Glasgow Regional Association of the SNP tonight discussing its strategy for council candidates next year, in which some of their candidates will be identified as, in the wards in Glasgow, will be identified as a place for a member of the BAME community exclusively to have that place. And I think that is a positive. We did that partly in the Scottish parliamentary elections. I think it's important that political institutions are a reflection of society there, and I do think we need to do better. And I'm a great believer that we need to take positive action measures to ensure that we make sure that we can address the institutional inequalities, to ensure that our political institutions are a reflection of society.
Chi, what can be done to better diversify political representation?
I think it has to, it has to be both the political parties. Chris talked about some of the measures that the SNP has put in place. And when I was selected, there was positive support during the process, which helped me. And I was part of an all-women shortlist, which made a huge difference in improving the representation of women in the Labour Party. It's now 52% women in the Parliamentary Labour Party. So I think every party should be held accountable for what they're doing to support a more diverse representation, because a parliament, in a representative democracy, a parliament which is not representative, it does not have credibility. And more than that, it does not. It reduces the confidence of the public. And I'd also say that this place, I don't know how much time you spent in Parliament, Shaka, but when you walk around it, all you see is, like I say, you see, paintings of dead white men in tights, basically, because that is still, that is still what the palace breathes and feels like. And so I think we need to see it as being representative of the Britain today. And I was ridiculed for saying that we needed to improve the paintings and the artwork around this place, but I think we do that. I also think, just to try that making votes at 16, bringing it into so that young people are voting when they're at school for the first time, and bringing it into the curriculum and making it saying, this is your parliament. Everyone should be able to enter politics as a form of sort of public service, as well as being a right of representation. I think that would help as well.
Caroline, I'm going to put the same question to you. What can be done to better diversify our political representation?
So this might be the controversial one. I think in Parliament and in politics, we spend too much time talking ourselves down and not actually championing the democratic values that we all stand for, that we all got involved because of. And until we're prepared to do that, we're not going to attract people to want to be part of it. We have to make it really clear to people how important our democracy and our parliament is. And I think it's woeful that we still attract so few women to stand as candidates, so few people of colour to stand as candidates. We have a building in Westminster that makes it really hard for disabled people to become members of parliament and to contribute to our democracy in that way. And it's why, I'm a huge champion of restoration and renewal. When we revamp that building, if we ever get round to revamping that building, we have to make it an accessible workplace that is welcoming to people, welcoming to not just people who work there, but to visitors, to showcase how important our democracy is. So I think that's a massive step. If you had asked me 10 years ago whether I would ever support quotas and all women shortlists, I'd have said no. But the reality is it's been 100 years, more than 100 years now, since women could stand for parliament, and we're still only at 30%. We have 10% of our legislative house is Black, Asian, minority ethnic people. And I don't even know what the stat is for disabled people, but it's minuscule. So there is such a massive way to go yet. And so from my perspective, I think, the Labour Party has been a real trailblazer in all women shortlists, but we need to start seeing much more work, certainly from parties, to make sure that it's an equal place for people to stand, and it just isn't at the minute.
Caroline, Chris mentioned our political discourse. Has Brexit affected how we discuss things politically, how we discuss things in the media?
Everything gets looked at through the prism of Brexit. Brexit, in the whole debate running up to the referendum in 2016, and then that horrible period from 16 to 2019, the level of political discourse, degenerated to that of the gutter. And those arguments still go on now, and they're really unattractive. I had a really controversial job for 18 months in Theresa May's government as the immigration minister. And I always used to say to people, I didn't only think really hard about every single word I was going to say, but also the tone in which I said it, which is why I find some of the debates now around immigration really, really hard, because it's being used as a political football, real unattractive dog whistle politics. And, it's why this week I spoke out against some of the measures that the government's trying to introduce, because I just think that they're not helping us raise the tone of our political discourse.
Chi, has the Sewell report contributed to that denigrating of our political discourse?
I'll be honest with you, Shaka. I was depressed, dismayed, and horrified by the Sewell report. And I was horrified, that it was commissioned by our Prime Minister, and it was given credibility by this government. And I'll just say a few reasons for it. I mean, on a basic level, the research it did was incredibly shoddy. It was kind of anecdotal. It was a couple of studies here or summaries or articles. So the research was shoddy. It gave a bad name to UK research. I'm trying to research minister. But then the conclusions it came to, which laughed in the face of people's lived experience. For example, that there wasn't institutional or structural racism. I think it's really important to understand the structural nature of much racism. Of a lot of racism today, that's something that's changed. People, in my lifetime, if you like, it's rare to get called names in the street, though it still happens. But the structural racism, the way in which you're more likely to have a decent pay rise, a decent job, in education, for example, Black boys are more likely to be seen as being troublemakers. All those kinds of things, need to be identified. And the health inequalities, which in COVID, we have, communities, there are more people dead in Black communities, in Black and minority ethnic communities, because of the structural inequalities in health. So that was really, really upsetting that was denied. And then I'll just say one other thing. There's a lot in, my background's in technology. The Sewell report said that the algorithmic bias, I think, is a really rising problem. People are having decisions made about them by algorithms which are entrenching and automating existing racism and bias. The Sewell report said that the answer to that was to define fairness mathematically. That is not an answer. That's not even that. I don't even know what that means. And repeatedly, the government minister for equalities tell me that there will be a response to the Sewell report. It was supposed to be in the summer. We're now obviously coming up to the end of the year, and we haven't had that. So I think that the Sewell report could have been. It was good, it could have. We've had lots of reports, about racism in different areas, but nevertheless, it could have been a platform for real change. As the nature of racism does change and it does evolve, and the response to it is that it must be cross-departmental and cross-institutional. But it was not only was it a missed opportunity, it gave a kind of red light to those who say that there isn't such a thing really as institutional racism, and don't you know that white boys do worse than in school. That's a really important point. And as the MP for Newcastle, which has a large working class communities, I want to see white boys doing better in our schools. But it shouldn't be like some kind of competition. It's not a competition for who is worse affected. We need to take racism seriously, and unfortunately, the Sewell report did not do that at all.
Chris, Chi mentioned that there have been a number of reports. One of those, Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, back in November 2020, put out their own report around human rights, and in particular how it relates to race. Their findings were the total opposite from what you saw in the Sewell report. Why did the Sewell report get the coverage and mileage that it did when the parliamentary report seemed to go unnoticed?
Well, probably because it's controversial, and probably because it suited certain agendas. I mean, the problem with the Sewell report, and I'll be interested in Caroline's take, because I think our committee ripped this the Sewell report apart, and it'll be worth quoting that. But it misrepresented evidence. It minimised the existence of structural institutional racism and actually perpetrated racist tropes. And I think that was and it's interesting that report ended up having to review its language when it then produced a revised version of its report. And I think it's just worth quoting this one part of the Women's Equalities Committee about the Sewell report. And it said that the UK government's equalities machinery remains fragmented, with ministers dispersed across several disparate departments, and its approach to equality issues lacks coherence. I think that really says it all. And I think that the parliamentary report would not have been seen as newsworthy, and I think that's a pity. I think, unfortunately, we now have a media now, particularly print media, is trying to compete with 24/7 news coverage. And a lot of things we see in the media are just clickbaits. You'll see a headline and then you read the story and there's no real correlation between that. And I think that's something as well we need to deal with. Is I do have concerns about media and the way it reports things and the way it tries to be controversial to grab attention. I think it's something we're going to have to tackle as a society as well.
Caroline Patel certainly championed the Sewell report. What is your position on that report? What is or your party's position on the report, and how we continue to address race and racism and the disparities, the well-documented disparities in our society?
So as chair of the Equality Select Committee, we worked really hard to get Tony Sewell and others of his commissioners in front of us. And there was real reluctance for them to come in front of the committee, have their report scrutinised, allow us to ask questions about it. They did eventually come. And from my perspective, there were bits of the report that acknowledged that they had not had the time or the resources to investigate things as deeply as they wanted to. I thought there was there were good elements to it in acknowledging that you really need to dig down much deeper, that the government lacks information and data, and you can't look at racism with one dimension, that you have to look at the differences between different ethnic backgrounds. And I think that's crucially important, is that we're not going to break down those disparities between the performance of Black African boys as opposed to Black Caribbean boys. We're not going to understand why Chinese girls are outperforming pretty much every other ethnic group unless when I say we, unless the government is prepared to invest the resources to do that. And, the thing we found as the Select Committee is that the Equality Hub, which I really welcome that being set up in the Cabinet Office, finding itself a permanent home, we really thought that was going to be an opportunity for there to be a real drive forward to beat down those, and I'm not afraid to refer to it as those institutionally racist problems that people in our society still face. And my committee spent pretty much a year looking at the impact of COVID on different groups of people with protected characteristics. And it's when you take evidence from a Black nurse who says she is afraid to go to her line manager to ask for different, better PPE that fits her properly so that she can be protected from COVID. And we heard that time and again, and we know that there's a massive number of ethnic minority people working in our health service. And we were hearing that the PPE was set up for white men, actually white American men. So, really square-jawed people, it just wasn't fitting them properly. But they were scared to speak out. And to me, that absolutely speaks to an institutionally racist organisation. If there are no lines of communication that someone at the bottom of an organisation can use to escalate their concerns to the top, then there's something wrong. Exactly the same as you saw in Yorkshire cricket, actually, was that there were things going on in the dressing room that players were afraid to speak out about, or they didn't know who to complain to. There was no structure to enable them to do that. And I think that's what we absolutely have to make sure we grasp and do so much better on, so that when there is racism, when there is discrimination, the people who are discriminated against can see a very clear route that they can use to get a resolution. And if that route doesn't exist, then that's an organisation that is not doing the best by all of its employees, members, whatever.
And you talk about players speaking out. Certainly in football, players have been speaking out for the last 18 months in the form of taking the knee, and an effort that was branded rather ridiculously, in my opinion, as gesture politics. I'll be honest, I'm not quite sure what gesture politics is. But what is your own position on players taking the knee? Is it needed? Is it still needed? What is the overarching call?
So my view on that is that it shouldn't be needed, should it? They shouldn't have to do that, but they do. And I absolutely support any player who wishes to express their view in what can only be described as a peaceful, kind of assertive way to do it, drawing attention to it, highlighting the debate. And it's no threat or harm to anyone. This is not a violent protest. This is not something that I think anyone can get upset or angry about. It's players using their platform in a very public way to highlight that there's still a problem. So I absolutely support them doing that, and would like to distance myself from members of my own party who criticised it. I think it's really easy to criticise people who glue themselves to the road and stop ambulances getting through. I think it's impossible to criticise a sportsman or woman who makes a positive, peaceful, kind of affirmative action.
Chris, taking the knee had become a symbol of the Black Lives Matter movement, started here in the United States, that went global for understandable and reasons that we've already discussed. What are your opinions around the Black Lives Matter movement as it exists in the UK?
I fully support the Black Lives Matter campaign across the UK. You see that in Glasgow with protests supporting the rights of asylum seekers, for example. We had only a few months ago, you had thousands of people in Pollokshields stopping two gentlemen being detained by the Home Office. And that was a huge campaign, and that was people exercising the right to freedom of peaceful assembly, and I was one of them. And so I think that people have the right to protest. And actually, I think what's happened in America around the NFL that you'll know, Shaka, I mean, it's still appalling that Colin Kaepernick is not a quarterback for a team. But certainly the position of the NFL at the time when taking the knee happened was one of absolute horror, one of condemnation. And the National Football League in America has completely flipped over in terms of some of its views. And you'll know as well, the Washington football teams had a report, and actually one of the casualties of that report was the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders, who's a team that I support, who had to resign as head coach because of emails that he was sending 10 years ago in some of the language that's being used. So I think certainly, I certainly support the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that what you're seeing in Scotland is the Scottish Government putting policies in place to ensure that education matters, looking at things like employment and equal pay and all of these things, because it's about institutional racism. You know, people who are the BAME population more likely to be unemployed or low paid, and it's all these things that we need to tackle. And I'm fairly pleased with the progress which the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, I would say, pretty unanimously across the parties, is looking to tackle these issues.
Over the last few years, we've witnessed such political turmoil, from Brexit and the separation of the United Kingdom from Europe. And now here we are discussing the global nature of the Black Lives Matter movement. So kind of in those two contrasts, let me ask, Chris, has the Scottish call for unity helped or hindered the tone by which we discuss some of our own political differences?
I think tone is important. I think positive debating is important. I think that it's always drummed into SNP candidates the real importance of positive campaigning and to ignore the negative campaigning. But I do think that we are seeing an increasing discourse of negativity, attacking people for their protected characteristics, attacking women for how they look, how they dress. It's something that no male politician will ever be criticised for how they dress and how they look. But, women colleagues right across the political parties will tell you the abuse that some of they get for some of that. If someone who's a being politician will, dress up in their national dress, cultural dress, that they get criticised for that. So I think that we still have some way to travel. I think that in Scotland, some of the language that we hear in House of Commons would not be tolerated in the Scottish Parliament. And we saw a bit of that yesterday, the conclusion of the new immigration bill, where some of the language, I think, got out of hand. And I don't think we should see that. And I think that we should condemn that, and we should do education and teaching correct behaviour and teaching correct language where we don't feel that that's appropriate.
Chi, let me ask, what are the differences in the issues between race, racism, and its history between where I am here in the United States and the United Kingdom?
That's a great question. And one of the strengths of the Black Lives Matter movement is just that it was global. And one of what I was very disappointed about was some of the reaction to some politicians in terms of inferring that it was addressing the same issues, as you like, in the US. So I lived in the US for a couple of years. I would say that the history of the US, and particularly slavery, and I think that recognition, which is growing now, but which we did not see in American discourse, of the nature of slavery as a founding part of the American nation, and how it has influenced every institution in the US, and in particularly the police. The democratic institutions as well, the whole history of the Democratic Party, the Republican Party actually is bound up in that. But particularly that relationship with the police and the penal system, or in the US. And so there's also, the US has a much larger Black population proportionally, and indeed a larger Black middle class. So for a specific example, when we, in the US, the only, in some states, in some counties, the only recipient effectively of public funds is really the police. Perhaps a little bit for education. There isn't a welfare system. There isn't any, a youth service system. So that's kind of defund that call, for example, to defund the police was about funding other public services and funding the diversion from the ridiculously high proportions of Black men, particularly, and boys who are in prison. Here in the UK, I'm calling for Northumbria Police to get more funding because the funding has been slashed for the last 10 years under austerity, and that keeps my constituents, helps keep my constituents Black and white and Muslim and without faith safe. So there is a big whereas here in the UK, much of our Black and minority ethnic population came here in response to our colonial history, which is also, in many ways, as complex and as invasive, if you like, as the history of slavery, but is different, created different communities, brought different issues of responsibility and redress with it, and also different, languages. And I think, just for one example, it's very interesting that in the UK, I think, Jamaican boys do very badly in education. In the US, Jamaican boys very much outperform African American boys generally. So there are significant differences, and it's really important to understand that. But it is also really important that I've spent time. I'm a member of the British American Parliamentary Group, and I've spent time engaging with the Black Caucus in America, which is the American representatives in the House and in Congress and Senate of who are Black. And it is really important also that we learn from each other and that we stand together, because one of the key things is that the Black Lives Matter movement made these issues sort of part of the national discourse in both our countries. However, that goes. People move on. Now we're talking about parties in Downing Street, which is a very important issue. But to keep those issues, because it's people's, to keep these issues in the front of people's minds, we need to join with similar movements across the world, because this is a global issue. It is not only a British or American issue.
And from a final question, and I'll go in reverse order. So I'm going to start with you, Chris, this time. Over the last couple of years, I think the question I've been asked most is, as we at the organisation celebrate our 25th anniversary, will there still be a need for show racism the red card in 25 years' time? I freely admit it's a question that I flounder with in trying to find an answer. But what is in store for us 25 years' time? Where will we be as a society? Where will we be as a community, as a country?
I think it probably will have to exist to make sure that the progress is being maintained. I think is probably the answer that I would give to that. Just thinking about that, but you're right. It's a very difficult question to answer. I think the key part of Show Racism Red Card is that education, language, discourse, and let's push all the political parties to make progress on employment, equal pay, education, and making sure that we have that diverse community. I'm very proud that Glasgow has a diverse community, and making sure that we have people who have protected characteristics at the very top, whether it is the top in politics, on the public sector, on the private sector. So, yes, I think there's still a place for Show Racism Red Card in 25 years' time. Hopefully, Shaka is building on the achievements and progress.
Thank you. Chi, I'll go to you.
So I think there undoubtedly will be a place for Show Racism Red Card. I think I would like to say that place would be kind of, historically teaching of racism as, a historical evil, the same way we might talk about, hanging, drawing, and quartering, a barbaric thing that happened a long time ago and doesn't happen anymore. Unfortunately, I think that given a lot of the debates, the discourse, the language that we hear today, from politicians, and I think the Nationality and Immigration Act was an example of that, and from others, given the rise of right-wing media and the hate on social media, given what I spoke about earlier, the entrenchment of many forms of bias technologically through algorithms, and without any accountability, regulation, or control, is that we're seeing. I think it's really unlikely, given the lived experience of so many of my constituents, so many people, so many members of Parliament, indeed. I think it's unlikely that racism will be eradicated in 25 years.
Caroline?
Look, I really want there to be no need for Show Racism the Red Card, but it's a great organisation, so we'll keep supporting it the whole while there is a need for it. And I think Chris picked up absolutely on the key point, is that you can't take your foot off the gas. You can't give up. You can't stop fighting. And even if we win, even if we can look at not just football, but all sports, all institutions, all schools, and say there is no such thing as racism anymore, you can never trust it not to creep back. So that's the reason why I think the organisation will have to exist.
Thank you very much. The idealist in me hopes that Show Racism Red Card won't be needed in 25 years' time. The realist in me says totally different. The realist in me is committed to us showing up every single day until we're no longer needed. I have to say, though, thank you very much, Caroline, Chi, Chris, for everything that you contributed today, for the discussion, the openness, the tone of it, the collaborative tone that we all shared today. And all of a sudden now, the idealist in me feels a whole lot better given this cross-party discussion. Thank you so much for joining me. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Shaka.
Thanks very much, Shaka.
Thank you, Shaka.